David, thank you for being here. Thank you for taking the time to meet with me. And I want to give you the opportunity to kind of introduce yourself and show what you do in research.
Sure. My name is David Wolfgang. I'm an associate professor in journalism and media communication at Colorado State University. And my area of expertise is kind of around journalism studies, studying the relationship between journalists and political institutions, audiences, and these different kind of like collisions of different interested actors from politics, citizens, and the media.
Yeah, and that's fascinating, especially looking at the way that journalism can intercept between different topics in our lives and kind of go across our everyday lives. And it's one thing that I especially think about is the recent history of online technology and the internet. And one of the first things I really wanted to ask was when you start doing the job of being a journalist, and once you start writing about journalism within itself and looking at how journalism can be seen from a audience perspective, I wonder how journalism and and audience perspectives clash within online spaces with the introduction of the internet, and how have those boundaries changed as time has gone on with technology evolving?
Sure. I mean, the internet is kind of like still, in many ways, a very contemporary and new concept for a
Mhm.
lot of us. Like it might, for many people, it's existed their whole lives, but for many other people, it's still relatively new. And
Yeah.
in an industry context, it's really new. Journalists were not terribly great at picking up on the internet in the earliest days, and that has still continued to haunt them decades later because in the early 90s when we saw this initial growth of a lot of different communication tools and media, like mass communication type tools on the internet, it was dominated by like the really insider tech nerds and academics, people who had access to the internet, quality access to the internet. It was not journalists. They came along in the late 90s and they kind of invaded on a space where they were initially not really part of the original club, the group that was invited to begin with. And so they've always played a relatively interesting outsider role on the internet. And they're continuing to fight these battles with, the kind of like OG internet culture type people where it's like this is our space, we control what the narratives are, we have the tools for communicating in a mass mediated space, and you, even though you have the prestige and the elitism of having all of these tools to have a powerful voice, we, the collective internet, are still kind of like the gatekeepers in these spaces, and we don't really like your kind of like um, approach to kind of assuming that we have this role to play and that we get to help decide the future of what society thinks about technology. And so we're continuing to still have these battles between these online communities and different cultural aspects of what it means to be online, and where journalism's institutional kind of context of like we are the paternalistic holders of knowledge and truth about what happened in contemporary society really come to a head. Because even if they're not the kind of people who were part of that OG internet culture, there's still this Wild West type consideration that like if I'm a part of internet culture, I get to have a say of what happens here because it's all about giving freedom and individuality back to the individual. And journalism really doesn't play that game very well because of its institutional context. So I don't think that problem's going away anytime soon, especially as the internet becomes even more increasingly um, driven by individualized culture. But it's kind of an interesting collision in the sense that you've got these two different cultural aspects that are both trying to accomplish similar things, but neither of them wants to give up that territorial kind of power or influence.
And I think, at least to me, it's almost a shape and form problem because I feel like a lot of things can be classified. as journalism nowadays, especially with people being on Instagram or YouTube and making their own investigative adventures into discovering what is really going on in the world and what is right and what is wrong and what's really going on. And I kind of wanted your perspective on this, especially since we're talking about the contemporary landscape of journalism, especially
Mhm.
within technology and social media. And I wonder your perspective about, you know, online comment sections and social media discussions on these social media platforms. And are they still useful for fostering public discourse, or have they lost their original value and now don't as hold as much authority as maybe traditional means of journalism?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen them shape and shift over time a lot, even just over the last few years. Some of the spaces that we've upheld in the past 20 years as being really interesting spaces for public discourse have completely crumbled in front of us, like Twitter/X, which
Mhm.
is just a shell of its former self.
Yeah,
And you go on there anymore. I got rid of my account, but if you try to go into that space anymore, it is just rife with pornography and
yeah,
nonsense and just like real advertising of like stuff you're not even looking for. And then, Elon Musk is somehow on everybody's feed, whether you follow him or not. It's just a nightmare scenario of public discourse. It's not quality anymore. And some of that is policy, procedure, governance, platforms. Like that's not a nature of just how people communicate. That's the nature of strategic choices made about how we should be communicating by those in power who set those rules. So that's one way. And we see that in every platform from Instagram to Facebook, not on the degree that we do on X, but they
yeah,
all have those similar policy decisions and choices that impact how communication happens on them. When it comes to other spaces, like comment sections you mentioned, or other forms of social media, um, we might not have the same degree of kind of shift or change over time, but we do have this similar problem of how do you promote and encourage quality discourse while at the same time giving people the autonomy and the freedom to express themselves how they see fit. Those two things don't necessarily go hand in hand very well. And the professional industry is all about quality over quantity. And they're going to continually get on their soapbox about how commenters don't know what they're talking about. And why do we give the audience space to discuss things when they don't understand the basic facts about what they're talking about? And they make these assumptions about what their audience is coming from. And those assumptions are based on the lowest common denominator, the kinds of discourse online that gets the most attention, the nonsense, the conspiracy theory, the craziness that drives engagement, because internet systems are designed to encourage engagement, not quality interaction or discourse, and those things don't really overlap very well. So I can't in some ways blame journalists for being so dismissive about the quality of content, but they're not exactly doing a lot to try and bend over backwards to make it happen either, in a way.
yeah. It's all about, I think, nowadays, maintaining credibility and authority. Um, and I've seen this, in my opinion, start to get better as time has gone on because you're right. You open up not even Twitter/X, but even Instagram and YouTube and see a sloth of stuff that just isn't true or is just there to gain as much numbers as they possibly can.
Mhm.
But going back to maintaining credibility and authority. I ask since the internet is the dominant form of communication nowadays, whether it be through social media or websites and blogs, everything is digitally online now. And I wonder, in your perspective opinion, how do journalists maintain that credibility and authority in this media environment that's so easily swindled and put into other people's courts? And how can people really learn to understand and trust the online journalism that is seemingly taking a hold on communication these days?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's one thing. They want to distance themselves from the online audience who they think is not trustworthy. And if they're seen as being in cahoots or in connection with that kind of discourse, it makes them look worse in their eyes. They're also kind of they're fighting an uphill battle because they're not necessarily doing a good job of defending the work that they do, providing context or transparency about how they do their jobs in order to help the audience understand what is quality journalism, what should it look like. They've in some ways they don't take up the battle cry of being able to stand up and speak out on behalf of journalism because they're so fearful that they don't want to be seen as being partisan or not objective, or they want to look independent when they're it's not really a question of independence. It's a question of whether or not you're going to advocate for your own work or your own profession, which is kind of a strange um, mis disconnect, I guess. Uh, I think that trust online becomes difficult because the normal rules about what distinguishes trustworthy content can often become really difficult to distinguish. And we don't have the same rules for media literacy online. We have audiences who are frankly quite poor at understanding media literacy online. Um, and retraining your audiences to better understand what's real and what's fake, what's true and what's false, what's a quality source which versus what is not, has become exceedingly difficult. And it's only become worse. TikTok has made that a lot worse. The nature of expertise on that app has really diminished the expertise of traditional forms of knowledge and information. But that's not a critique as much as it is also a critique of institutions who have been very slow to have a presence in those spaces to counter that information. Journalists are terrible with TikTok, and they're kind of like afraid of it in a way. And it's like they're losing that communication battle because they won't step into the spaces where they're kind of being undermined.
Yeah. Yeah, and I have to agree with what you're saying. I don't blame them either. I mean, I love what you said earlier about it kind of being the Wild West, and I feel like it still is the Wild West in some ways of because there is no rules. I mean, there are rules, but really there isn't. You can pretty much say and post virtually anything you want, whether it is truthful or not. I've seen them try to combat these social platforms, especially YouTube and Instagram for example, within some Instagram videos now have um, fact checks within the bio, linking to the
Mm,
Wikipedia page of events that they're talking about. And similarly with Instagram, um, certain posts will be blurred out and give you a fact check of what's actually going on that the video is describing. Or even now with AI videos of Sora making
mm,
things that look so believable. Because I feel like in some ways, AI is just another thing that is going to be added onto this, a pile, another stone to climb because it's true and evident within what you're saying that you're right, that media literacy is something that as much as we advocate for and even being taught now in early education classrooms such as elementary school and middle school, still people even my age, and especially older individuals, still don't understand how to critically think about what they see online because everything is online now. I suppose it was a bit different back in the day when things were printed on newspapers and there were more simple websites of blogs, but now there is so much, it's literally uncountable what you can find. And I wonder if you could, you have an extensive career, and I wonder when you start to see that shift and change. Because I feel like there was a time to where the internet was created and people had good intentions of what they reported or what they wrote about in some way. And then I think as slowly as time went on, people understood what they could truly get away with. And I think it's benevolent in some means of what people were able to do. And I just kind of wonder, like, when you saw that significant change and or shift from where things started to really change with journalism really starting to become online and take a part of social media.
I mean, I've never stopped to think about it. That's why I'm kind of like pausing a little bit. I
Yeah.
mean, journalists didn't really get well into the internet culture until the mid to late 90s. And they don't seem to have this online first mentality until sometime in the mid 2000s, around the time that social media was really taking off, like when Facebook emerged in 2003, 2004, and later. So, like, the early days of the internet discursively was, the nerds of the online world who were just like living out their participatory culture dreams of like building their own little unique websites where they all interact with each other about their niche interests. Websites were incredibly niche in the 1990s. You'd build your own site where you just did whatever the hell you wanted, and then you would just like circulate with your friends around the same topic. And it was among a small cadre of people, but it was incredibly participatory, but it didn't have a broad audience. Even if the internet was supposed to open it up to the world, it was a small group of people. Social media comes along and really kind of shifts that game where it connects people based on identity and based on real world connections. And then based on online connections, it creates networks of people that are far more intense than what we had in the late 90s. And it kind of takes away this private sphere of the internet that existed within. The internet is a public space, of course, but like in the 90s, it was like you could still have your own little hidden corner of the internet with other people of like-minded interests that you kind of hung out with. And that went away. Social media took it away because we connected everybody to the point where you couldn't have a secondary persona, you couldn't have secondary interests. It was your identity online. Now, of course, people can have a Finsta or something else or like a fake account or other things, but like for the most part, you have taken on your personal identity online. And strangely enough, that also ties in well with when things probably took a turn. And I'd say it's not because people behaved differently 2005 and on. I think it would be because things were more noticeable from then on. Social media, everybody's accounts are accessible. They're tied to your personal identity. Your
Yeah.
avatar and your persona are you, the human being, and it all exists in perpetuity for people to find and dig up later and cancel you because of, or, you know, um, for you to get into fights with people you've only ever met in real life like twice on the internet
Yeah.
just because it's the thing to do. I would say that social media culture probably leans itself toward this kind of behavior of troll culture,
Yeah.
of online conspiracy theories. But let's not neglect the idea that in the 90s, in the early days of the internet in its context of a modern sense, like the world, like in hypertext markup language type internet, uh, there existed an ugly underbelly, but people went looking for it and they found other people like them. And you could mostly avoid certain parts of it if you didn't want that. But then all of a sudden we bring the ugliness into the mainstream through social media and it's proliferating your feed. It's all over your page and it's driving engagement through rage bait and all kinds of other problems where it's getting all this interaction that the system thinks you want to see more of this because other people want to see more of this because it makes them angry. So you should be angry too. And that kind of driver of discourse is kind of like a downward spiral. I don't know if I answered your question, but I think that's.
Well, I think it's still interesting, though, whether you answered it or not, about how things still have ended up in this way that seems so unfathomable back then when the internet was still first around. It's almost the law of unintended consequences of whether we have created this thing that was wonderful and actually scientifically amazing to think about if you take the time to really think about what it's able to do, but also in the same time has allowed for some of the worst people to congregate together and to spread their beliefs, whether they have the right to do so or not, is not the question. I think the question is, why have we gotten here? And why is it so proliferated now? And it makes me think about, even for example, the idea of having on some posts online, whether it be photos or videos or even just articles and essays, some outlets have completely removed the comment sections entirely
Yeah.
for their posts. And I want your opinion on this. I think it's very fascinating. Does this strengthen or actually weaken the connection that we have to spreading ideas or overall spreading information, whether it be true or not, is not the question. But does this strengthen or help? I It's almost like a necessary evil, but is it even the point?
Well, I'm going to answer that question from the perspective of thinking about it as a journalistic purpose or function, not just public discourse generally.
Yeah.
And a lot of news websites have gotten rid of them. They shift the conversation to Facebook and Twitter. They force you onto a platform and to make a deal with the devil, whether it's Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg, in order to participate in public discourse, which I think is an unfair um, kind of deal to have to make, because they don't want to be associated with the negative content. Journalism has a long history of trying to avoid being associated with things that look bad. Advertisers don't want to be next to that. They're like, we don't want to advertise on your website if our ad's going to pop up next to somebody spewing neo-Nazi nonsense in an article that has nothing to do with anything about fascism or Nazis or anything else. And that's what they're afraid is going to happen. So websites want to move away from it. Well, we tend to think that journalists have a normative duty or obligation in society to help promote forms of public discourse because it serves a role in helping to encourage public participation in political activity and to make people more informed citizens, to make them more tolerant of other viewpoints and perspectives. Don't mean that they have to change their mind because they encountered a viewpoint that's different from theirs, but we shouldn't assume that they should be allowed to avoid all contrary opinions as well. So, pushing it off of their website is a dereliction of duty in a sense. But from an economic perspective, I can't really argue with their choice. Um, but structurally, there are better ways to maybe develop discourse and police it and enforce it and build systems that are more efficient and effective at actually encouraging quality rather than rage bait and anger.
Yeah, and I think it all comes back to connecting it to that system. I think as time has gone on, a lot of people, not everybody, but I feel like a lot of people have confused social media with journalism and vice versa. They kind of see the two as one whole thing, which I can't blame them for necessarily. I definitely, since I can remember memories, social media has been around. I'm just was born in the turn of the century, and I just have always remembered social media being a thing. And so it's hard to think about living a life without being able to go digitally online and speak my thoughts or have or report things and vice versa, whatever it may be. And and you talk about, the system that it kind of envelops, and I wonder, you know, journalism has become more reactive and in a sense tied to the cycles of social media. And I wonder, is this something that is necessary for the continuism of journalism on this contemporary online landscape? Or has this actually lost the sense of reporting and has become a more deep reflection of what people just want to post online?
You seem to be asking what sounds like an agenda setting question, which is journalism losing the power to establish what is important or what is newsworthy? Are they
Yeah.
losing it to social media, which now dictates what people are talking about, what people care about, because this is what people are saying. And journalists are frequently relying on social media in a broad sense as a source of information. Look at what people are saying online, which you can cherry pick all day long, the specific types of perspectives you want. And, maybe three people are talking about that specific issue, but you can make it look like it's newsworthy because social media says, which is just nonsense. But in a way, it's lazy, efficient. I mean, those things can go together. Lazy and efficient type of journalism where you can pull together quotes and information without going out on the street and trying to talk to strangers and putting a microphone in their face and asking them what they think about today's latest issue. But you're also handing them over control to dictate what is the newsworthy topic that day. And when you give in to that cycle, it's hard to then, kind of like release yourself from that addiction because it becomes the simplistic way of gauging public opinion in a way that looks legitimate but really isn't.
And that's interesting because I think it cloaks itself so well into it. Um, spending any amount of time online, I think, can do that, especially in the realm of Facebook and Instagram, where taking, for example, the topic of politics is so widely talked about now, and so many short form content videos are now made about it. It's easy to see a topic or discussion point or uh, news discussion to be blown out of proportion or not shown at all for vice versa reasons. And I wonder, taking that idea I've just said and looking at it from like an education standpoint, when you go to higher education to learn uh, journalism, um, as a journalism educator yourself, what are some of the main things that you're like that students should learn that should be taught for people who are aspiring to be journalists to navigate this modern landscape and where it seems like in a way algorithms and speed and views and all of that seem to be the dominant factor rather than, let's say, the truth or what's really important.
Yeah. So, I mean, education is still going to be built around the basics that we need to have there, the skill set to produce quality content and to make good decisions. But like increasingly, we have to rely more on these these really important critical thinking skills, like media literacy, recognizing quality information over not so great information, acknowledging your role you serve in society, and that sometimes you have to make decisions that might mean choosing to produce or publish information that might be in the public interest, but is not what the public is asking for, kind of in a weird way. Like, you know, turning a blind eye to maybe the kind of like you know, lowest common denominator entertainment-based content or rage-bait content to try and produce content about real issues that are happening in society. Take the government shutdown that we're like living through right now. It's really easy to just produce a story where Trump says this and Schumer says that, and this is what they disagree about, and they're just yelling at each other on the news, and just let them have their 10 seconds, or like put Speaker Johnson on there and give him his 10 seconds. And they're not saying anything, but you could go into a story about people who are living without access to food stamps now because of what's happening, or somebody who's working without a paycheck because they have a necessary government job. And like the differences in how we could tell the same story through very different perspectives and serve a public interest when in the back of your mind that story about Trump yelling and other politicians yelling back at him are going to get far more viewers. But you make the difficult choice to go, that's not what they need, regardless of being what they might think they want. Those are not easy choices because you've got your organization, your corporation, pressuring you to increase views, to increase sales, to build up advertising revenue. And you're telling them, I'd rather go after the story that's going to bring in fewer people. Like, that seems really contrary to what we think is best. But trying to teach people those kinds of critical thinking skills, getting back to your question, is a part of that really important aspect of making good journalistic choices that serve the public good, even if it's not what the public says they might want most from what you're doing.
Yeah, and I think that goes back hand in the hand of like what people come out of school with, whether they go to school for that or not. I think it's necessary to kind of understand why we watch the things that we watch and what gets the most views and why does it, even though it may not be the most important, because who cares what these politicians say? Because in fact, their lives do not affect ours. What affects us is whether we can get food on the table and whether we can get our paycheck to pay the bills, vice versa. What I want to get at though from that is what skills and or perspectives do modern aspiring journalists need, such as media literacy, which we've talked about, but also some things that maybe we wouldn't necessarily think about, or some things that maybe you've even experienced throughout your career. Like, what are some things that you don't realize that especially journalists need to be successful and to uh, navigate a changing world?
Yeah, they increasingly need to understand better about media engagement and audience engagement, how to talk to and how to think like your audience
Yeah,
to make decisions about how to present information in a more effective way. SEO, um, we have to
yeah,
increasingly think about the way in which information is pulled and gathered by answer engines, like everything from ChatGPT to Google system
yeah,
to Claude. Like, how is my information going to be used in ways that I can't think or know it's going to happen? You know, journalism is increasingly being poached for information to be used by other exploitative services. What's going to happen to it? They need to be thinking about what are the kinds of problems and issues that are going to be at the forefront of conversations in the next 5 to 10 years? How is AI going to affect what I do? Am I replaceable? That's the question nobody wants to say out loud,
yeah,
but they all need to be thinking about. How do I make myself irreplaceable in a world in which device can potentially recreate what I can do in mere milliseconds?
yeah.
And how do I prove that my value is more than what it can do? Um, that is an extremely existential problem for college students to have to be facing when they're trying to learn how to just try and survive in a profession or a job. But we don't have a choice. We have to think about those kinds of questions as well. Those are things that I was not thinking about when I went to school. I mean, that was years ago now, but that's still like we were still in the age of the internet, and the internet has just changed so much over the last couple decades that it's just a completely different game in terms of audience engagement and the nature of what it means to produce quality content.
It's 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 a brave new world, in my opinion, and something that will you don't really think about until you're already, you know, drowning in 10 feet of it, you know. So I think it's something that will, I'm sure there will be things that I've never thought about when I was in school right now that I will be dealing with when I'm out of it. And I wonder in some ways, what are some of your predictions on how things will go from here on out? Which is a tough question because there's a lot of things that we just won't know until they happen. But wait, where do you see things going in the future of the way that journalism works within the online media and vice versa, and everything else that we've spoken about broadly?
God, I mean, I feel like I would be a fool to try and predict what's coming, but I think in a general sense, I mean, we have to be adaptable and innovative to survive in this field. Thinking about new ways of reaching audiences and producing systems and platforms and tools that don't exist now, being where your audience is. I can't believe we still have to tell journalists to do that in 2025, that you cannot anticipate your audience is going to come to you, especially if you're just reproducing content on your website. Because we have seen the incredible decimation of audience direct traffic through news websites. It's all through social media, it's all through search. And if you're not there, you're not going to be found. And in many ways, producing content exclusive to that platform, producing your stories differently for TikTok and Twitter and Instagram and Facebook. It's a lot of work, but it has to be done. I think that we're heading toward new immersive types of storytelling formats, explanatory journalism that serves a public purpose, but that is more uh, immersive and interactive, without sacrificing journalism's democratic mission and
Yeah.
goals and public service function. And we're going to have to be more willing to face increasing credibility crises like deepfakes, misinformation, generative AI. Um, we need to be ahead of those problems, when historically we're usually following 10 feet behind, always trying to keep up with those kinds of problems.
It seems increasingly so. It will continue to be like that for a lot of reasons. And I always wonder about how certain roles will evolve. For example, I go to school for film production, and yet Sora AI can replicate phenomenally good-looking videos, which are telltale of AI, but within a few years, who knows what they can look like? and with ChatGPT able to spit out paragraphs and paragraphs of some prompt within milliseconds. I find it increasingly detrimental to what the mission is. But I think in a general sense, what I find interesting the most about this is how the evolving role, if stayed true to its mission, I think will always prevail in some way. Because in some way, I always believe there will be telltale signs of what is true and authentic and what is not.
Mhm.
And I wonder if you see journalism's role evolving at all in certain ways, good or bad, or maybe neither, staying in the same place it's been. But do you see it evolving into something else to where just like how in my opinion, journalism has evolved a lot into social media and how social media works and having journalism tied to names and personal brands and profiles. Do you see it evolving into something else like that?
I think what we increasingly are going to see is the blurred line between what is and isn't journalism. So the actions of what is a person who is doing journalism is going to shift into people who, um, 20 years ago we would have said, well, they're a blogger, they're
Yeah,
freelance, they're outside, they're an influencer. Those people are increasingly blurring into that space and territorializing the field, and journalists don't really have the power to exclude necessarily. They can try, but in a sense, it's always been a contestation for that soapbox in a sense. Um, it's a really powerful role, and there's no doubt that others would like to carve out a little corner or piece of that space for their own messaging as well, because you have this power and influence to establish this like epistemological context of what is knowledge, what do we know about the world today, and when political actors and economic actors and influencers of other kinds have this kind of like space to squeeze in and take a hold of that authority to speak in the same way and to help establish what we know and what's true. I mean, they're going to take advantage of it. So we're going to see an increasingly growing space for who does this work and an increasingly difficult time for people to distinguish what they might consider legitimate from illegitimate forms of that like journalistic knowledge production.
yeah. Yeah, and I think increasingly so, people have started to take a hold onto that and start to realize that, but still, taking 5 minutes to scroll on Instagram, for example, you'll instantly find something that's either A, not just true, or B, true, but skewed in such a way to where it values more of the reputation of social media metrics rather than the true metrics of true journalism. And I wonder in my mindset, I wonder, what is there to be optimistic about? And I answer that as I do not know. But I constantly say this, but we can theorize. And I just wonder what the future will look like, good or bad. I always wonder what the future will look like because in my opinion, the future is here before we know it. You blink and 5 years have passed. What gives you optimism about the future of journalism and its relationship with the public and with the public being so easy to access nowadays to be able to post anything online, anything on your website and submit things without free of charge. What gives you optimism for the future, if there is any?
Well, I've already established myself as maybe too much of a contrarian because you're assuming that I don't. I mean, I, I'm still optimistic about the fact that there's, we live in every every day we live in a world in which there is more information accessible and available to humankind than the day before, and that is only exponentially becoming more the case. And journalism itself, news itself, is not losing its social cachet in terms of people still seek out contemporary information about important events and issues in society. Are they getting it from spaces that we always want them to? No. Are they still actively seeking it? Yeah. Are they passively engaging with it? Yes. People, even if they don't want to, are seeing it through their feeds and other spaces and through their interactions and their conversations. They don't, I mean, like, you don't even have to actively be seeking news and you're still going to stumble upon it. Do we have the opportunity to make it more accessible to more people? Absolutely. But is it somehow that society has given up on the idea of wanting to be informed citizens? I don't believe so.
And that is the viewpoint because I feel like in good nature people will realize that if they haven't already now, you know. And I think as time goes on, in some way that will become more prevalent than maybe it is right now.
Mhm.
Um, Especially with how, you know, with with how many influencers there are. And I use influencers as an example because they are the most prevalent people to get the social media metrics, which is a big factor of what journalism uses nowadays, social media to inform people. And I find it fascinating as time goes on, the shape and form of these things and how it's evolved. Um,
Mhm.
and I also want to ask David, is there anything else that you'd want to talk about before we end this? Are there certain topics that maybe we hadn't discussed that you would really want to bring to light?
I mean, I think that, in general, I have a really strong feeling about the importance that journalists play in a political context specifically. But there's a lot of other spaces in which they serve important roles about educating and informing the public about other topics of interest, lifestyle, culture, sports, entertainment. Like these can be important areas as well, important aspects. But this idea of how we promote the political over other aspects of society only becomes more important the more we're in these political crises, these kind of like
Mhm.
um, continuing, kind of like ever present, kind of one after the other political crises that kind of draw people back toward these sources of information and political systems. So, in a way, journalism is really quite strong in a moment of political crisis. Are they financially strong all the time? Not always, but like people come back to us as an institution of knowledge and trust and credibility in these moments. Maybe it'd be nice if there were more of them. But it's kind of this nice cycle of information that helps to reiterate and reinforce the importance of a well-informed and educated society that's making decisions in democracy that impact all of us. So that's ultimately where, like, I would hope we come back to in terms of a conversation about what's journalism's role, what purpose does it serve. The fear is that, sometimes the citizen moves on. Sometimes the structure of how we have journalism is changing. For instance, our government is not as interested in funding public media anymore. So we have, NPR and PBS, which aren't being held up as well as they used to. We've got, you know, commercial broadcasters who are giving up on their public service role and caving to political institutions. CBS and ABC, notably, I mean, CBS canceled Stephen Colbert over the fact that he was critical of the president. I mean, the idea that we are like completely removing political expression because of the message that somebody makes, a totally relevant message that those in power don't like, is really bordering on totalitarian influence on media. So we have all these threats in terms of corporate commercial media, and it's um, a very powerful influence because the money speaks in terms of being able to produce content. Journalism's not cheap, and it's not going to produce itself.
Yeah. And that's a really good point, is that journalism is not cheap. I think a very it's a profession that I think people wouldn't think is expensive, but yet it is, whether it be from hiring and equipment and whatever else may be. It's an expensive profession that I find fascinating. And I wonder also as well, um, you know, when you when when you started out, I wonder how things were different then and how they've evolved, whether it be technologically or just even like practices wise. I wonder how much has that changed from when you started to now being in a position to where now you teach it to the same people that you were that time ago?
So my first moments in journalism about 20 years ago were, really naive and simple in a context. Like my stories, I had daily deadlines. I didn't publish what I wrote as the day went along. Like if I learned new things throughout the day, we weren't putting them as breaking news on the website. We waited, and everything I put together was put into one well-packaged story that was published in the next day's print edition and then went online, maybe not till 6 or 7 the next morning. And like the idea that we lived in that 24, like one 24-hour cycle
Yeah.
is still wild. So like there was no no increasing pressure for um, deadline reporting. We were kind of like living in a very simplistic cycle. Um, I wasn't producing multimedia content to go along with it. I was just writing print stories. I had little to no engagement with my audience. If I came into the office the next morning and my phone was blinking, so I had voicemails, I knew that I had triggered audience reception, and that's about the only way I would know. And then you always hoped and prayed that it wasn't somebody like really pissed off and that it was just somebody like thanking you, which was not normally the case. But um, I mean, like, it was such a naive moment in terms of what we got to do. But the 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 cachet that came with it is kind of addicting. Like you have this powerful role to help set the agenda for what people understand about their community. And this was local journalism, mind you, but still, like the local community had an interest in knowing what their city council was doing. What's that new building that's going up on the corner? What's this thing that they're working on? And like you got to help set the agenda for how that was informed to the public.
Mhm.
Yes, that's still there, but like not nearly in the same context of where nobody else had the same kind of knowledge producing authority to tell other people about what was happening in society that you did. And while that's kind of a power context, it's a really heavy responsibility. But
Yeah.
in a more modern sense, you're always competing against the other people in society who want to have a voice as well. And mind you, I think that that's very democratizing, but to have a distinct voice in that market is increasingly difficult. Um, but journalism holds on based on its credibility, and increasingly that's getting weaker and weaker.
And gosh, I wonder as well, being on that local level, what are some of like the main, you know, hmm, what were some of the main lessons you learned being on the local level? Because local level on a grander scale seems so small to deal with. But I think especially when you're starting out, it can be really intimidating, I think, in a sense, to talk about what goes on in a place that you live and breathe and enjoy your life. And I wonder, what were some of the main lessons you learned from doing journalism on the local level? And maybe even if you applied to the more higher and more public level of some other people.
Yeah, I mean, people are really passionate about their local communities, and I took that for granted. You write about something that you think is rather trivial, and it can drive people's engagement, good or bad, in ways you never would have saw coming, because they are very passionate and concerned about protecting the integrity of what they respect about what's important to them as a community. And so you never really knew what was going to trigger that audience response. Sometimes you'd write a story about what you thought was a controversial topic and you heard crickets. And other times you'd write about something that you thought was inane and trivial and it had everybody fired up. And I think the internet has taught us that that's actually pretty true. And we know that now a lot better because we've seen how people in meme culture respond to the strangest things in the most absurd ways. But it taught me to respect a lot more about what everyday people care about in their communities, how the personal is political, and that everyday lives have political contexts. That many times some people care a lot more about what's happening in their neighborhood than what might be happening at 30,000 feet in their nation or state even. That localizing national news can be more valuable to a local community than trying to tell them why they should care about what's happening on the other side of the earth. Not that that's not important, but what's happening down the street is, even if it's trivial, is far more important to them many times than what's happening in Palestine or Ukraine, for instance.
Yeah.
Nothing against that, but that's many times how people are kind of like seeing their internal little world in their mind. Um,
Yeah.
and so it was really valuable lesson about trying to understand the unique perspective of local communities. And I loved it. And a lot of people think of it as like this pastoral kind of like um, bygone context that people shouldn't care about, that it's just trivial. But I disagree.
Yeah, and I think everyone has a testimony to that fact. As for example, when I go back home to my hometown, I will pick up the newspaper and I want to read about things because I live and grew up in that area and I do care about it. So I think hearing that lesson and then making it think about my own life about when I read things that I care about in the newspaper or that I read an article about online, and I was like, well, this is, for example, having a building demolished that I frequently visited would make me feel a certain way because like I used to go there. I
Yeah.
spent money there, like, come on, and those are the things that get people going. And it's interesting because you just wouldn't think that, it's interesting how much people don't care about what goes on in Washington, D.C. versus who do. And you might make the generalization that they do care, and I'm sure they do, but it's actually interesting, like you were saying, about what goes on in their local community versus what goes on in their nation's capital or whatever it may be. And I think that's a really important thing that people don't think about. And I think it's a really good point that you touched on, and I've thought about in
Yeah.
my own life. Um,
Yeah, I mean, for instance, going back to the story we were talking about a few minutes ago about the shutdown, you can tell a story about food stamp cuts, or you could go and interview somebody at your local food bank. Like,
yeah,
there's one story is going to be a lot more compelling. It's the local food bank than the national story.
yeah, yeah, and I think especially when we talk to people that we even might personally know, or that other people who read it might personally know themselves. And I think it's able to connect them on a more personal level that allows those things to be opened up clearly and more and to be more understandable, to have the ability to put yourself in other people's shoes, especially if even if it's just reading about it and all the way up to watching about it or seeing photos and or videos about it. So.
Yeah, it has greater impact, which is something that we don't always talk about, but is an important part of good journalism.
It is. It is. And I think it's also a part of that fact that it's part of the human experience that a large majority, 95% of things, I would assume, uh, if I may, assume that journalists report upon are things that are conditioned within the human experience to where even when we read about it and or watch multimedia about it can make us feel a certain way and relate to. And I just think that's fascinating that when we think about it, I think in our heads, we wouldn't be able to understand it. But I think even, having someone report upon a personal story that goes on in your city or your local community can make you realize like how much you then understand it in some way, even a bit better. And I think that's another really good, important, faceted part of journalism.
Yeah. People want to read about other people. They're fascinated. We like to, whether it's slowing down to look at a car accident as you drive by or reading about
Yeah.
what neighbors are up to, like we're fascinated by what other people are doing and what's happened. And that's just a reality. Human interest. So,
Yeah, and I think a lot of times people don't understand human interests and it's subversiary, it's you don't think some things would capture the human interest, but then they do, just going back to like what we were saying. And I think that's really cool. And David, thank you for coming on here and talking to me. I really appreciate it.
yeah, I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much, Broden.
Yeah, have a good day now. Thanks again.
Dude, bye.
Bye. See ya.